everybody. Do I need to close that?
Please just click got it.
So thank you, James, for inviting me, and thank you all of you for coming. I'm speaking today about a new and ongoing project that I'm working on. The paper that this talk is based on is still a work in progress, so I really welcome all of your comments, questions, queries at the end. The paper itself is part of a wider project run at the University of Edinburgh called Quantum Theology Beyond Copenhagen. Several contributors are working on various ways theology and religion can enter into dialogue with non-Copenhagen approaches to quantum mechanics. This is one such paper. As for me, I'm primarily a philosopher of religion, and I work on a relationship between physics and Christianity. So my concern here today is to take a particular physical theory, in this case, the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics, and explore its implications both for religion and for philosophy. I'd just like to make one small caveat before getting into the substance of the talk. I'm not a philosopher of physics, so please forgive me if I've oversimplified some of the physics in this. Hopefully I haven't, but please tell me at the end if I have. So my aim today is not to argue for a particular interpretation of quantum mechanics. Rather, I want to explore what many worlds might mean for the lived experience of religious persons, and whether it might force theism to re-examine some of its core claims. As you may have already gathered from my title, I will argue that many worlds, or at least the radical reading of it that I'll be focusing on today, raises some significant worries for Christianity, which require immediate attention. There are, I'm sure, many more worries for theism that stem from many worlds, but my focus today will be on the following. 1, personal identity. 2, the problem of evil. And 3, the nature of Christ and salvation. So before delving into the specificities of my argument, I wanted to take a moment to talk about the interdisciplinary field that this sort of research falls under, science and religion. The field of science and religion is relatively new by academic standards, having emerged in the middle of the 20th century. As it's interdisciplinary, it contains a melting pot of philosophers, theists, scientists, and those who are various combinations of these. Oxford is a leading hub of science and religion, so it's a really exciting time to be a researcher in this field here. The field itself contains many strands of inquiry, primarily in areas where there's natural overlap between the disciplines. So I've indicated some of the areas here, such as origin questions, both about the universe and life on our planet, whether religious beliefs have evolved and what this might mean for their truth status, and in more generally, the implications of particular scientific theories for religious claims. It's a rapidly growing field, and regardless of their personal theistic beliefs, contributors to the field recognise that reality is highly complex and cannot be understood by a reductionism of any kind. Whilst philosophy or theology can offer explanations of some facets of life, it cannot provide the kind of empirical knowledge the natural sciences can. Moreover, while the natural sciences offer a highly accurate and reliable means of understanding the physical world around us, they cannot shed light on moral or existential questions. As philosopher Mary Midgley astutely remarks, reality is so complex that we need multiple conceptual maps to adequately represent it. Science and religion not only recognises but embraces this fact, encouraging conversations that transcend the boundaries of a single academic discipline. So you might be wondering what I'm doing here today at a philosophy of physics seminar, if I'm not a philosopher of physics. Well, as scholars who engage in both philosophy and physics, you will already know how valuable interdisciplinarity is. By bringing religion into the equation, I hope to offer a different perspective on what will be to you a familiar landscape. If the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics is true, then there will be incredibly far-reaching consequences which resonate far beyond the boundaries of physics. So I want to get stuck into this and provide theists with an indication of how, and to what extent, many worlds might prove problematic for their worldview. I also want to indicate some potential real-world consequences of our more abstract physical theories. Furthermore, interdisciplinary conversations create a rich and dynamic research environment. Such an environment is likely to foster creativity, as well as allowing the disciplines involved to be more outward-facing. This is why I love interdisciplinary research and why I think it's so valuable. But again, as philosophers of physics, I'm sure many of you will share my views on this. So science and religion, unfortunately, tends to lag behind a little when it comes to the science. For this reason, science and religion discourse on quantum mechanics has been completely dominated by the Copenhagen interpretation. Yet, in philosophical circles, the reputation of the Copenhagen approach is poor. As Tim Maudlin argues, the Copenhagen interpretation is not actually a physical theory at all, as it contains neither a clearly defined ontology nor an unambiguously formulated dynamical description of how that ontology evolves. Instead, it just tells physicists to shut up and calculate. So, Maudlin dismisses the Copenhagen approach as a vague recipe whose reputation in the fields of philosophy and physics and quantum foundations is dwindling. For this reason, I'm arguing that it's time to move beyond Copenhagen approaches to quantum mechanics and focus our attention instead on other interpretations, at least within science of religion. So I've chosen the Everett interpretation as its implications have the potential to radically reconceptualize both our understanding of reality and our place within that reality. So, what is Everettian quantum mechanics? I won't be saying anything you don't already know here, but I think it's helpful to make sure we're all on the same page about how I'm understanding and using the interpretation in this talk. What we now call the many worlds interpretation was introduced by Hugh Everett III in his PhD dissertation, written at Princeton in the 1950s. David Wallace writes that on many worlds, quantum mechanics can be taken literally. The only catch is that when we do take it literally, the world turns out to be rather larger than we had anticipated. Indeed, it turns out that our classical world is only a small part of a much larger reality. So, Everettian quantum mechanics posits the existence of a multiplicity of worlds. But what does this really look like? The worlds posited by Everettian quantum mechanics are real, or at least they're as real as our own world. What this means is their inhabitants are just as real as us. In fact, these worlds contain people who are just like us. As Everett explains, from the viewpoint of the theory, all elements of a superposition, all branches, are actual, none any more real than the rest. The total lack of effect of one branch on another also implies that no observer will ever be aware of any splitting process. Everett's theory in a nutshell is this. There is a wave function of the universe, and this wave function obeys the Schrödinger equation. At a measurement event, and perhaps in all instances of decoherence, each outcome in the possible range of outcomes obtains. They obtain, however, in different parts of the wave function that cease to interact with each other. Wallace identifies two parts in many worlds. First, it contains the contingent physical postulate that the universe is veridically represented by a unitary evolving quantum state. Second, it contains the a priori claim that a realist interpretation leads to a multiplicity of approximately classical, approximately non-interacting regions, which look very much like the classical world. Though on first blush, it seems highly radical and unparsimonious in the extreme, proponents of Everettian quantum mechanics argue instead that it's actually the simplest interpretation of the formalism. Many worlds takes the equations as mapping the actual state of the world, without adding further postulates, hidden variables, or collapse mechanisms. So there's quite a bit of disagreement about precisely what many worlds means metaphysically. Unfortunately, these disputes can't be covered in a single paper, at least one written by me, and even less so in a paper about many worlds implications and not its hermeneutics. However, it's worth me briefly stating two different ways of interpreting Everett that I identified in the literature, perhaps there are more, and identifying which one I'll be focusing on today. So one way is to hold that at a measurement event, the universe splits or branches, leading to two or more worlds in which each possible outcome obtains. This is perhaps the original view, held notably but not exclusively by David Deutsch, Bryce DeWitt, and Paul Tappenden. Another option, defended by David Wallace and others, is to claim that the worlds do not split. Rather, the worlds are patterns in one universal quantum state that emerge as a result of its component parts being entangled with one another. In other words, when a system interacts with its environment, leading to decoherence, quasi-classical branches emerge from the quantum microphysics. So we do still get many worlds on the second view, but these worlds are not fundamental and do not split off from one another as they do on the first view. Rather, there exists a superposition of emergent worlds. So we can explore the differences between these views using the famous example of Schrödinger's cat. I've tried to illustrate, obviously in a very rough and ready way, how these approaches differ using photos of my own cats. So in this talk, the two options will be asleep and awake instead of alive or dead. This version of the problem is as follows. A cat is locked in a box with a device that will break open a vial of sleeping gas if a radioactive particle decays. The likelihood of decay during the hour that the experiment runs is set at 50-50. Before measurement, textbook quantum mechanics dictates that the particle is in a superposed state of both decayed and not decayed. And this leads to the paradoxical conclusion that the cat is both asleep and awake. A splitting version of many worlds solves this problem by claiming that this case does not involve a superposed cat. Rather, it involves multiple worlds, some which contain awake cats and some which contain asleep cats. In short, each possible outcome of a given event, i.e. decayed, not decayed, asleep, awake, actually happens. They just happen in non-interacting branches of the wave function that have split off from each other. Whichever state of affairs we observe will be open in the box, indicates which world we are in, but the other worlds are equally real. The emergence version solves the problem of Schrödinger's cat by claiming that the cat becomes entangled with the box with the room it's in, and the room with its wider environment, and so on. This then leads to the emergence of two boxes, two rooms, two planets, and ultimately two worlds, though these worlds are supervenient on the same microphysics and share identical histories, and then evolve independently. It's not within the scope of this paper to argue in favour of either of these alternatives. My concern is identifying and examining the implications of many worlds for ordinary human persons. As such, I've decided to select a reasonably robust reading of many worlds and proceed from there. Given this, the remainder of the talk will take many worlds as claiming A, that the universe splits or branches, and B, that the worlds that ensue are as real as our own. Though this is not a universally accepted reading of many worlds, its metaphysical implications are momentous. Therefore, it is worthy of serious theological engagement, insofar as one accepts that hermeneutical uncertainties require the conclusions drawn to be taken with a pinch of salt. Another reason for examining the implications of the more radical view is due to the insistence of many proponents of the more conservative view that their reading of Everett does not have to have very significant implications for ordinary life. Thus, if the conservative view is correct, a paper of this kind may be neither necessary nor particularly exciting. Yet if the radical, branching reading of many worlds is true, then there are many interesting implications to investigate. For example, on many worlds, there are myriad persons who share our past experiences, who have branched off from us, and who will go on to live different futures. Who are these people? Are they versions of me? Should I care about what happens to them? Recently, I was invited to interview for my dream job. As I was incredibly nervous, one of the ways I tried to reassure myself, semi-joking, was by thinking, well, if many worlds is true, you probably do get the job in at least one world. You just have to hope you end up in the right one. Yet, in reality, I would not find it reassuring to think that there's another version of me out there who got the job if the me in this world did not. From my perspective, that person doesn't feel like me. Their future will deviate significantly from mine, and we will never meet again. Whether we have a shared past feels somewhat immaterial. On the face of it, I really have no reason to care what happens to her once our paths diverge. In fact, I may not be any of these future persons if I cannot survive a branching event. To shed light on these puzzles, we must turn to the philosophical literature on the persistence of personal identity through time. So almost all human persons have the intuition that we continue to exist through time. Though we might colloquially say, I was a different person back then, or I'll be a new woman moving forward. We don't mean to say in any serious, substantial, or metaphysically meaningful sense that the person we were in the past, or will be in the future, is a qualitatively different human being than the person we are now. Without the belief that personal identity persists through time, such things as punishment for past crimes, property law, and reconnecting with an old friend wouldn't really make sense. Because this is such a deeply held intuition, it's received a substantial amount of philosophical attention, spanning back to the ancient philosophers. Though there are several proposals for what constitutes one's continued existence through time, sometimes also called the persistence conditions of transtemporal identity, the most popular are A, psychological continuity views, and B, brute physical relation views. The former holds that an individual's identity, and therefore their continued existence, depends on some form of psychological continuity. This may be continuity of first-person memory, continuity of conscious experience, or some other psychological characteristic. Psychological continuity views preserve the intuition that we would survive if our consciousness were uploaded to a computer or if we woke up in a different body. But they seem incompatible with the claim that I was ever a fetus or could ever enter into a persistent vegetative state, as neither of these involve consciousness in any recognizable sense. Brute physical relation views, on the other hand, propose physical persistence conditions. For example, an individual continues to exist if their body exists, and their existence can be traced back to each stage of their development, including prenatal. Generally, physicalist views claim that we are biological organisms, and our identity is inextricably bound up with our bodies. While physical views can comfortably accommodate the intuition that I was once a fetus, they're less compatible with the idea that a person could continue to exist in some futuristic setting in which their consciousness was separated from their body and their body destroyed. So, on the psychological continuity view, the baby and the old man, depicted here, are numerically identical, namely they are the same person, if and only if they are directly or indirectly psychologically continuous with one another. So this might mean the old man remembering being a child, but more likely it's him remembering some previous stages of his life, and these stages being linked to prior stages by a chain of memories. So the old man can still be the baby, even if he doesn't remember being a baby, as I'm guessing most of us don't. On the physical or animalist view, however, the baby and the old man are the same person if they have bodily continuity. So that basically means that the body that was once a baby has become the body of an old man, even if there are no exact same cells from the baby's body to the old man's body. The baby and the old man are different developmental stages of the same human animal. These two views are the primary contenders for the persistence conditions of transtemporal identity. So one way that personal identity and persistence conditions are explored is through thought experiments. These tend to ask whether identity could be preserved in a range of scenarios where various characteristics are altered or removed. One such set of cases in the literature is known as Fission Cases, which considers whether a person's identity could be preserved after splitting into two or more persons. Without many worlds, Fission Cases are interesting but currently unrealizable philosophical exercises. Everettian quantum mechanics, however, implies that fission, albeit in a slightly different sense, may have been part of reality since long before philosophers existed to contemplate it. Fission in this context is the splitting of an individual into two or more persons, each of whom is psychologically continuous with the pre-fission individual. So let Alice be a being who will at some future time t undergo fission, and let lefty and righty be those two persons who exist post-fission. The problem is as follows. After t, is Alice identical to lefty, righty, both, or neither? The physicalist must conclude that Alice has died, as Alice's original body is no more. However, both lefty and righty are psychologically continuous with Alice. If only one of them existed, it would be a straightforward case of continued existence, according to the psychological continuity theorist. But how can we make sense of identity when there are multiple persons who have an equal claim to being Alice? According to Leibniz's law, if I'm numerically identical with some object, I must share all the same properties with that object. Thus, if Alice is numerically identical with lefty and numerically identical with righty, meaning Alice shares all the same properties with lefty and righty, then following the transitivity of numerical identity, lefty and righty must be numerically identical with each other. Quite clearly though, lefty and righty are not numerically identical, as they occupy distinct spatial locations, presumably have different streams of consciousness, and can operate entirely independently of each other. Thus, they do not share all the same properties, and so they are different persons. Another way of putting it is in the words of Derek Parfit, that identity is a 1-1 relation, and so it collapses into incoherence when branching occurs. Fission, then, is sufficient for Alice to cease existing. Psychological continuity theorists seem forced to conclude that both lefty and righty are identical to Alice by virtue of having psychological continuity with Alice, whilst not being identical to each other. This violates Leibniz's law. They've offered several solutions to this problem, and I've created 3 of them here: the so-called multiple occupancy view, the no branching view, and when applied to many worlds, stage theory. The multiple occupancy view, in brief, claims that if there is fission in your future, then there are multiple occupants of your body up until the fission occurs. Before T, Alice was actually lefty and righty. Both lefty and righty are psychologically continuous with Alice. As before T, both lefty and righty are multiple occupants of Alice. Therefore, their identity is preserved post-fission. Parfit, rightly in my view, notes that the multiple occupancy view greatly distorts the concept of a person and should be rejected. As I see it, whether the multiple occupancy view works for bifurcation is somewhat by the by. It collapses into absurdity in the context of Everettian quantum mechanics due to the sheer scales involved. In a recent but popular book on many worlds, physicist Sean Carroll writes, "We do not know how often branching occurs, or even whether that's a sensible question to ask. But we do know that there is a lot of branching going on. It happens every time a quantum system in a superposition becomes entangled with the environment. In a typical human body, about 5,000 atoms undergo radioactive decay every second. If decay branches the wave function in 2, that's 2 to the power 5,000 new branches every second. So if branching occurs as frequently as this, then at any one time, I'm not one person. Instead, I contain a non-denumerable infinity of persons, or person stages, and I'm woefully mistaken in believing that I'm one person whose experiences and perspectives are unique. This is both extremely difficult to square with our intuitive understanding of our own identity and quite hard to make metaphysical sense of. Claiming that each moment in our lives we contain perhaps an infinite number of overlapping persons who share our thoughts and experiences stretches our reasonable, common sense understanding of identity past breaking point. At least for the theist, and perhaps for the philosopher too, our intuitive understanding of personal identity is that it's a one-one relation between individuals and themselves, and not a one-many relation between an apparent individual and a non-denumerable infinity of person stages. Moreover, we should not need to abandon the idea that I is a meaningful word by which we can, with certainty, refer to ourselves. Happily, the alternative no branching view avoids these problems of overpopulation and self-referential uncertainty. Rather more unhappily, however, it implies that each time branching occurs, we cease to exist. The no branching view holds Alice's continued existence depends on any future person's psychological continuity with her, and the added caveat that no other being is psychologically continuous with her. Therefore, the no branching view claims that before T, Alice exists, and after T, Alice has ceased to exist. Instead, lefty and righty have come into existence. If just righty had come into existence, sharing psychological continuity with Alice, then righty would constitute the continued existence of Alice. But once lefty is introduced, Alice has ceased to exist, as an individual cannot survive a branching event on this view. So in short, fission is death. The post-split persons are not Alice. They are new persons who have stepped fresh into existence as she was destroyed by the splitting of worlds. Yet this too feels totally alien to our intuitive understanding of our own identity. In fact, it leads to the conclusion that the 6-year-old child I remember being is A, not me, and B, has ceased to exist. Though I'm psychologically continuous with the child, she has not survived the many branching events that have occurred in the 20 years that divide us. Moreover, the no branching view holds that each person with whom I'm psychologically continuous exists only for a very short time. So if many worlds is true, then on this view, I'm not the same philosopher who started writing this paper, despite the fact that I currently hold all the ideas in my head, remember doing all the research, and feel as though I've been writing it the whole time. If many worlds is true, and we want to retain some semblance of the concept of personal identity, then the no branching criterion, I argue, must either be significantly amended or rejected. Paul Tappenden's solution to the problem of fission, in a specifically Everettian context, is to adopt the stage view of personal identity developed by Theodore Sider, whereby persons are not an aggregate of person stages, many of whom can be within a single individual at any given time, as in some versions of the multiple occupancy view. Instead, persons are stages, and one individual contains maximally one person stage at any one time. Therefore, any utterance at a time has a token which is associated with the unique body, itself a stage, which is the body of that person at that time. So stage theory claims that each individual claims at most one person stage at a time, and future branches contain future counterparts to Alice who share Alice's history, but these new person stages are individuals in their own right. This view is similar to coherentism, whereby persons are comprised of temporal parts and thus are never wholly present at any moment in their lives. This is opposed to eternalism, in which persons persist in their totality through time. It differs, however, in its much more radical claim that persons are not comprised of stages, they are stages. In applying this to many worlds, Tappenden argues that an individual survives branching by being continuous with pre-branching temporal parts, and individuals who branch off from each other share past parts, but are not identical post-branching, so they do not share future temporal counterparts. Although detailed consideration of this view falls outside the scope of this paper, I encourage the interested reader to turn to Tappenden's work for further discussion. So much has been covered and very little solved in the previous discussion. If we take a no branching view or bodily continuity view, then the fission of many worlds is death. One possible way forward is offered by Parfit, who argues that philosophers are mistaken in thinking personal identity is what is most important in fission cases. We should not ask, am I identical with some past or future person, but have I survived? Whilst identity is an all or nothing phenomenon, most of the relations important in survival admit of degrees. Parfit argues that after T, Alice is neither lefty nor righty, but that this doesn't really matter. What we should care about is survival, even if the being that survives is not numerically identical with us, and we ought to regard division as being about as good as ordinary survival. If we take Parfit's view, then, we need not worry about the fission cases in many worlds or otherwise, as the relation of the original person to each of the resulting people contains all that matters in any ordinary case of survival. And in Everettian branching, unlike in most other fission thought experiments, we do not even have the awkward consequence that there are two or more persons in the same world with only one life to be lived, i.e. only one spouse, one job, one house, etc. Tappenden's view also preserves our intuition that identity is both singular and self-referentially non-arbitrary. Though it's necessary to consider these questions in any metaphysical analysis of many worlds, they cannot be answered within the scope of this present paper. The preceding analysis has done what I intended it to do, to show that there are worries for many worlds that pertain to personal identity. It's by far from clear what personal identity looks like in the Everettian picture. As the identity of individuals is an important concept for theism, this is a pressing problem for the theist. As for the solution, I'll leave it as an open question as we move forward to consider how identity and multiplicity in Everettian quantum mechanics might shape our understanding of particular theological issues. So the first of my worries that pertains specifically to theism is the problem of evil. The problem of evil is the oldest and most frequently cited argument against the existence of God. And for this reason, entire libraries could be filled with literature written on this issue. One might be forgiven for thinking that nothing new can be said on this age-old problem. However, I argue that in the context of Everettian quantum mechanics, this problem is raised in new and highly interesting ways. In extremely broad brushstrokes, the problem of or argument from evil holds that evil and suffering present a significant challenge to the existence of God, insofar as that God is held to be omnipotent, i.e. all-powerful, omniscient, i.e. all-knowing, and perfectly good. Evil and the suffering it causes tends to be delineated into natural evils that occur as a result of natural processes, such as earthquakes, and moral evils that occur as a direct result of human agency, such as murder. The argument comes in various forms, and it's most commonly divided in accordance with whether the argument is deductive or inductive. In the former case, if the premises are true, then the conclusion must be true. In the latter case, the truth of the premises increases the likelihood or increases the evidential basis of the conclusion. Now, these two tend to be referred to as the logical and the evidential problems of evil, respectively. The logical problem holds that any instance of suffering is logically incompatible with the existence of God. The argument runs as follows. Premise 1, God is omniscient. Premise 2, God is omnipotent. Premise 3, God is perfectly good. Premise 4, an omniscient, omnipotent, perfectly good being has knowledge of all instances of evil, the power to stop evil, and the desire to stop evil. Conclusion 1, if God exists, God will stop evil. Premise 5, evil exists. Conclusion 2, God does not exist. So according to this deductive argument, a single instance of evil renders the existence of God with the properties of omniscience, omnipotence, and perfect goodness impossible. To refute such an argument, one must deny at least one of its premises. In this case, one can cite the possibility that God has a good reason for allowing evil to occur, even if that reason is unknown. This is best illustrated with an example. One can easily imagine a situation in which a seriously ill child suffers after an invasive operation. That child may wonder why their parent, usually loving and protective, allowed them to endure so much pain, fear, and confusion. The child's focus is on the suffering they experienced, but the loving parent knows that the suffering was a necessary means to a greater good, i.e. the child's life being saved. That the child is unable to understand the parent's reason does not entail the absence of a reason. So opponents of the logical problem of evil make an analogous claim with regard to God, which is comprised of one or both of the following claims. First, they claim that some evils are such that their occurrence is logically necessary to allow the occurrence of goods that outweigh them. Second, they claim that some apparent evils serve a far greater purpose to which humans are blind. This position, called skeptical theism, raises the skeptical possibility that human beings do not or cannot have epistemic access to God's reasons for allowing evil. We are too intellectually and spiritually inferior to understand divine motivations, so the argument goes, but the theist may trust that the goodness of God will override even the worst possible evils in the end. However persuasive one finds this, it is sufficient to defuse the logical problem of evil. All one needs to do is point out the premise 4 is false, by claiming that there might be reasons an omniscient, omnipotent, and perfectly loving God would allow evil. Without premise 4, the argument collapses. Neither conclusion follows. So, skeptical theism is sufficient to undermine the logical problem of evil. Nevertheless, the evidential argument remains a highly credible alternative. It uses some or all of the following. 1, particular instances of evil and suffering. 2, particular distributions of it. Or 3, the sheer amount of it, as evidence in favour of the atheistic position. With regards to 1, philosopher William Rowe gives an example of a baby deer trapped in a forest that lays in agony for days before succumbing to death. The deer's suffering seems to serve no greater purpose. It's a classical example of the intense, ubiquitous, and banal suffering in nature. As the theist maintains that the natural world was created by God, suffering in nature is often used as evidence against a perfectly good creator. Moreover, one might argue in line with 2, that many innocent individuals endure debilitating diseases, while others sail through life with perfect health. This can be used as evidence that God is either callous or absent. Finally, with regard to 3, one might simply state that the world contains so much suffering that any positive evidence for God is totally dwarfed by comparison. Examples of this include genocide, child abuse, nuclear and chemical weapons, natural disasters, the list goes on. So, whilst the logical problem of evil is easily diffused, the evidential problem continues to raise serious concerns for the viability of theism. In their paper, Horrendous Evils and the Goodness of God, Marilyn McCord Adams and Stuart Sutherland offer insights to help illuminate exactly how many worlds exacerbates the problem of evil. Adams and Sutherland identify a particular class of evils, namely horrendous evils, whose existence raises the most significant objections to the existence of the God of classical theism. Horrendous evils are evils, the participation in, the doing or suffering of which gives one reason, prima facie, to doubt whether one's life could, given their inclusion in it, be a great good to one on the whole. Such doubt arises because it's so difficult humanly to conceive how such evils could be overcome. Adams and Sutherland suggest several examples of horrendous evils, And I don't need to go into details for you to imagine the sort of things that they might be. Many solutions have been suggested to avoid the problem of evil. Adams and Sutherland argue, however, that standard responses totally fail in the face of horrendous evils, as they tend to be both generic and global answers to what are deeply individual problems. A theist may receive comfort from the abstract idea that evil is not God's fault, as it's a result of human freedom, or evil facilitates the developmental process towards spiritual maturity, or that on balance, there's more good than evil in the world. This is unlikely, however, to soothe the pain of a mother whose child has been abducted, abused, and murdered, or the survivor of a prolonged and brutal torture. Adams and Sutherland argue that the reason for the failure of standard responses is that they do not distinguish between two equally important descriptions of God. On the one hand, God is described as a provider of global goods. On the other hand, however, God is understood as a loving parent who cares deeply about each and every person. So while generic global solutions that paint a broad brush picture of God as a being who creates a world which on balance contains more good than evil, these fail to comfort those who experience such deep suffering that their life is not, to them, worth living. Despite the fact that the free will defense is often used as an explanation for moral evil, it would be cruel beyond measure to try and reassure the survivor of abuse that their suffering was a worthy price to pay for the free will of their abuser. Global solutions do not always work for individual problems. Those individuals need a solution grounded in the latter description of God as a loving parent who cares about them both individually and intimately. How does this apply to many worlds? Contained within the foundations of the Everettian picture is the claim that there are multiple versions of me, each of whom share my past, but whose futures deviate from mine at the time of branching. Some individuals will have split off from our shared past at very early stages of development, while some may have split in the more recent past. This creates a set of individuals who vary from me in various ways, and some of whom diverge so distinctly that we will have developed very different personalities and grown on to make very different choices and live very different lives. Taking these individuals as the set of all versions of me, it must be the case that there is at least one version of me who's living the worst possible life, allowed both by the initial conditions and the evolution of the universe according to the Schrödinger equation. This may well include participating in horrendous evils. If Adams and Sutherland are right, and I believe that they are, then these versions of me are suffering so greatly that they feel their life no longer has positive value. Could it be that God would choose such a state of affairs? What kind of creator would weave such suffering into the very design of the universe? An optimistic theist may wish to turn this problem on its head. They might acknowledge that whilst there is countless more suffering in Everett's many worlds, there is a correspondingly greater amount of good. For every suffering version of me, there's at least one version living the best version of my life, and countless more living very good ones. So on balance, the distribution of good to evil is not so different to the world described by non-Everettian physics, and the problem of evil is no greater post-Everett than it was before. Now, I reject such a response, and my reason for doing so hinges on Adam and Sutherland's distinction between God as a provider of global goods and a lover of individual persons. Joy and suffering are not morally equal. If forced to choose between curtailing the joy, pleasure, or happiness of one person to stop some other person's suffering, our moral intuitions tell us that stopping the suffering must always take precedence. As such, the benefits befalling some versions of me are vastly outweighed by the price and suffering that other versions have to pay. As a provider of global goods, one might see how a God could choose such a design that vastly increases the number of persons who are able to enjoy virtuous, joyful, and fulfilling lives. Yet, as a parent who loves each individual creature, it seems inconceivable that any God could create a reality in which at least one version of every single person is living the worst iteration of their life possible. Any argument regarding a global distribution of goods and evils ignores the plight of those individual persons who suffer most greatly, recognizing only one aspect of the divine nature. A suffering individual should be something worth avoiding, not a necessary price to be paid for any amount of happiness or goodness offered to others. As Rode puts it, arguments against the existence of God on the basis of evil are required to demonstrate not just that evil exists, but that gratuitous evil exists. Essentially, atheism is likely true if there exist instances of intense suffering which an omnipotent, omniscient being could have prevented without thereby losing some greater good or permitting some evil equally bad or worse. Such evil is good evidence against the existence of an omniscient, omnipotent, and perfectly good creator God. I argue here that it seems as though many worlds does contain gratuitous, intense suffering. It seems reasonable to claim that there are other possible worlds, possible universes, that an omnipotent God could have created, which do not involve a multiplicity of branching events, or the multiplication of individuals, perhaps ad infinitum. At the very least, the existence of the many other interpretations of quantum mechanics, and surely the possibility of many alternative physical theories aside from quantum mechanics that God could have constructed, these give good reason to suppose that God was not restricted to only one physical blueprint for creation. In choosing many worlds, if he did, God constructed a universe in which countless versions of me exist, many of whom are suffering. Presumably, an omnipotent God could have created an entirely different set of laws to avoid this problem altogether. Following the nomenclature of Robert Russell, this line of argument concerns what's called cosmic theodicies. So these are arguments from and responses to evil that concern the laws and cosmological structure of the universe. Russell argues that those who deny divine responsibility for evils that follow directly from physical laws elevate the problem of evil to one of cosmology. According to Russell, this response fails for those who claim that God is truly omnipotent. God, as an omnipotent creator, must have had radically free choice over the fundamentals of nature, including the laws of quantum physics. Thus, an omnipotent God could have created another type of universe altogether, in which the cruelties of our own universe could have been avoided. So cosmic theodicies don't actually solve any problems. Instead, they push those problems back one step. Though God may not be directly responsible for each individual instance of suffering, God is indirectly responsible insofar as God created the features of the universe which cause that suffering. God could abdicate responsibility for the suffering of those specific persons who suffer greatly, as their suffering is due in part to the branching of the wave function and not divine intervention. Nevertheless, God does bear indirect responsibility for instantiating a set of physical laws that renders the suffering of some versions of each of us, though it's initially arbitrary which ones, inevitable. If any theist contests this, concluding instead that many worlds is the best of all possible worlds, following Leibniz, or that this universe contains necessary disvalues that allow positive characteristics to emerge, following Christopher Southgate and others, then I argue the burden of proof is theirs. So, to sum up, I have argued in this portion of the talk that the theist must face a new and enlarged version of the problem of evil if the radical version of Everettian quantum mechanics is correct. So I now move on to the last part of the talk, namely the part about Christ and salvation. So this is the least philosophical portion of the talk, but I hope you'll find it interesting nonetheless. One of the most important aspects of the Christian doctrine of salvation is that the goal of earthly life is to attain, or at least to begin to attain, salvation. The world is allegedly fallen, and this is something from which humanity requires saving. So far, so good for the theistic Everettian. However, the worry arises when one considers exactly how that salvation is supposed to be attained. Christian scripture claims that the only way salvation can be attained is through Jesus Christ. Now, this raises problems of epistemic access for individuals who live in places that the Christian message has not reached, or who lived before Jesus was born. I argue that this problem may be even greater in an Everettian universe, as it is possible that there are branches of the universal wave function which do not include any person named Jesus of Nazareth. In a different branch, a slightly different set of events may have led Pontius Pilate to spare Jesus' life, or the fetus that was to become Jesus may have succumbed to a genetic disease of the kind Jim Al-Khalili and John Joe McFadden claim are influenced by quantum processes. Indeed, some branches will have split off from this one so far back in the past and evolved independently from ours that their world will be inaccessible and utterly unrecognizable to us. Human history may have taken a completely different path. leading to people with no understanding of a Christian God at all. Whether or not one believes this is theologically plausible, on the splitting version of Everettian quantum mechanics, it is physically possible. So this raises the final worry for many worlds. Can the theist confidently claim Christological presence in all branches? And if not, must they conclude that the branches without access to Christ are damned? 20th century theologian Thomas Torrance offers some insight here by exploring the relation of physical space to the incarnation. The incarnation, namely the doctrine that says God came down to earth and took human form, has been of utmost importance since it was articulated in the Nicene Creed. This stated that the eternal Son of God for us and for our salvation came down from heaven, therefore claiming that God himself is actively present within the space and time of our world. Torrance argues that time and space are created forms of rationality that exist in distinction from, but are fundamentally related to the rationality of God. He writes that the incarnation asserts the reality of space and time for God in the actuality of his relations with us, and at the same time binds us to space and time in all our relations with him. We can no more contract out of space and time than we can contract out of the creature-creator relationship. So Torrance goes so far as to say that now the incarnation has occurred, all other conceivable routes to God within space and time have been invalidated. This act forms the great axis in God's relation with the world of space and time. If Torrance is right, then the relationship between God and creatures in the spatio-temporal realm, including creatures' ability to receive the Christian message and be saved, is inescapably bound up with shared spatiality. Christ entered the world of space and time, and it's through sharing that space with him that individuals come to know him, so the argument goes. Without the spatio-temporal context for the self-revelatory incarnation event, its entire meaning is lost. So what this means for many worlds is this: if there are persons who exist in branches that do not contain Jesus Christ and the soteriologically significant events of his life, then they are unable to relate to God in this way. God is not in their space, so to speak. So though Christ can still be claimed to be in creation, he cannot be claimed to be in all non-interacting branches of that creation, meaning at the very least that the Christian message is epistemically inaccessible to those who do not share a branch with any version of Christ. This conclusion is highly problematic for any theist who claims that the only route to salvation is directly through Jesus Christ. So the best and perhaps the only morally acceptable model of salvation available to the theists in many worlds is that of universal salvation. Universal salvation, or universalism, is the claim that every created person will eventually be reconciled to God, no matter their personal shortcomings or misdeeds in their earthly life. This view deviates from many classical approaches to salvation, in which salvation is only possible through Christ, either through epistemic assent to certain theological propositions, through good works or grace, or some combination of these. Importantly, in the context of Everettian quantum mechanics, universalism provides an explanation for how those who are unable to access Christ for reasons outside of their control are nonetheless able to be saved. Despite the fact that Christ is not present in their branch, there are other means by which the inhabitants of that branch can reach atonement. So I argue that these cases are analogous to those individuals who lived in a time before the Christ event, or who lived in a far-off region of the world that was not reached by Christianity during their lifetime. For them, the Christian message was fundamentally inaccessible, and yet it seems immoral to hold them responsible for this, as one's birthplace and birth time is determined by a historico-geographical lottery. Salvation should not be decided on chance alone. Rather than the Christian having to claim that these individuals cannot be saved, universalism provides a framework in which their salvation becomes an inevitability. So salvation is still within reach for all people. For this reason, I argue that universalism is the best model of salvation available to the theist in the context of Everettian quantum mechanics. So to sum up, I've argued today that theists should take Everettian quantum mechanics seriously. And taking it seriously, or at least a radical reading of it seriously, leads to three worries: one for personal identity, one for the problem of evil, and one for Christ and salvation. So I want to conclude by restating my hope that theists are called to respond to these problems, so that if this version of Everettian quantum mechanics turns out to be right, then their theistic worldview is prepared to take on its novel challenges. Thank you.